How did a movement against racist police violence turn into a row about a 1970s sitcom? Is it because the secret agenda of the woke left was always to control what you see and hear so as to rewrite history? Or is it because some dumb TV execs panicked and our corporate media jumped at the chance to make a row about life or death into one about an apparently all-consuming culture war? Aaron, which one do you think it is?
Probably a bit of both. I mean, the argument that was made this morning on BBC Radio 4 with Ash Sarkar, our very own Ash Sarkar, was that in the sort of prevailing culture around this stuff, that corporations will err on the side of caution. And caution in regards to changing social mores and so on, that's great. I agree, we should do that. But when caution isn't being exercised in so many other areas, when you see the BBC circulating communications to internal black and minority ethnic employees to not express solidarity with Black Lives Matter, doing that at the same time as a different network, it must be said, withdrawing temporarily an episode of Fawlty Towers seems somewhat ridiculous. I think it shows the extent to which these people at the top of Britain's economic and cultural life aren't really ready for a serious debate around racial equality.
Whether we are about to enter a culture war or whether this is just a phony war sort of trumped up by Britain's political class, that's going to be the main theme for tonight's show. But we're also going to be talking about the new economic news, a record-breaking downturn in Britain's economy. I'm going to be speaking to Miatta Fahnbulleh from the New Economics Foundation about that. Oh, well, I spoke to her earlier in the day. We're going to show that interview later in the show. My apologies. We'll also be talking about Keir Starmer's record-breaking popularity. I think we're going to close the show with that story. Before we do that, tweet on the hashtag TiskiSour, share the stream. Let's get more people watching this live. So, social media was set alight this morning by pictures of the statue of Winston Churchill and the cenotaph being boarded up in anticipation of protests this weekend. Let's take a look at some of the tweets, the image, and the commentary that sort of accompanied it. I think we've got one from Sajid Javid up here. So depressing. So you can see that Winston Churchill has been boxed up to prevent him getting damaged. Any protests over this weekend. We can get up a Piers Morgan tweet. This photo shames Britain, says Piers Morgan. The fact Sir Winston Churchill's statue has had to be boarded up to stop people vandalizing it is disgraceful. He saved our country from the Nazis, and this is how we repay him. Appalling. And it wasn't just Piers Morgan and ex-cabinet ministers. Boris Johnson himself weighed in, first with a Twitter thread and then with this clip on BBC. Let's take a look.
What's happening today is that you've got a situation in which the statue of Winston Churchill, who is a national hero, has had to be boarded up for fear of violent attack. And that, to me, is both absurd and wrong. You should not have a situation in which people who are protesting on one basis are violently attacking the police or public property. And I'm afraid what's happened with these demonstrations is that a tiny minority, or actually a growing minority, unfortunately, have hijacked them, and they are using them as a pretext to attack the police, to cause violence, and to cause damage to public property. So unfortunately, my message to everybody is that for all sorts of reasons, they should not go to these demonstrations. And whatever our feelings about the cause, we should not support a demonstration that is in all probability, looking at what's happened before, going to end in deliberate and calculated violence.
Now, I find all of this really worrying, actually. I find it quite sinister because whilst we've said on this show, I don't think it's, particularly strategically useful to, I suppose, vandalize or attack Winston Churchill because he's got a complex history. Yes, he's got, awful racist, colonialist views and actions past. His impact in India was terrible. But also he, led the fight against the Nazis, and I don't think he can be completely dismissed as a historical character. But what's going on here is a completely trumped up hysteria from Britain's political class and media. No one has yet attacked this statue. This is the police taking completely reasonable precautionary measures to try and prevent something potentially happening at a demonstration on a weekend. And suddenly the whole Black Lives Matter movement is being blamed for something which it's not just, it was done by a minority. It hasn't happened yet, right? And also it's important to notice that this, people, if you were looking at Twitter this morning, there were so many people on the right trying to say, this is where it all ends. This is the slippery slope. It's finally ended with Churchill of all people, boarded up. This isn't new. This has happened before. I mean, we can get up a tweet from Pippa Crerar from the Mirror. So she sort of put together all the examples where this has happened before, not remotely unique as an event. So in 2001, Churchill and the Cenotaph were boarded for May Day protests. In 2007, Lloyd George plinth was protected after Brian Hoare protesters camped on it. In 2008 and 2009, the whole of Parliament Square was fenced off due to Occupy protests. And in 2017, Churchill was boarded up for the Million Mask March. Now, I can't remember a big deal being made out of any of those events, particularly not, in 2017, presumably it was a very similar image if they just boarded up Winston Churchill. I don't remember any sort of, cultural freak out that this was going to be the collapse of British history and civilization, because it wasn't, they couldn't say this is, or they couldn't use this to attack a campaign for racial justice.
There was also the protests in, was it 99 or 2000 or 2001, sort of auto-globalization protests. It was the first time the statue was vandalized. He had a quite famous image of a piece of turf over his head to look like a mohawk, like a punk. Yeah, the 2010 student protest, it was vandalism. It was just kind of a spray paint of a message underneath him. It wasn't even necessarily an attack on Churchill. It was just talking about basically not increasing tuition fees. So like you say, this has happened repeatedly. And it's important to say as well that there were other statues. All of the statues were actually boarded up, including Nelson Mandela. But naturally, that doesn't fit with the message here, which is about a tiny minority of protesters want to attack and vandalize this national hero. Actually, this has been taken in regard to every single statue in the local area, because there was an anticipated protest coming this weekend. We'll talk about that. It now looks like it's going to be a bit of a damp squib because the far right wants to turn up. But then today, Tom Robinson says, actually, we shouldn't turn up. Realistically, that's probably because he'd be in breach of some bail conditions one way or another. He doesn't want to go back to Nick. But I agree. The way this was received by certain people, from Piers Morgan to Boris Johnson, is quite revealing. And look, it's one thing for media to mislead the public about something, right? They do that. And that's kind of their right in a way. That the freedom of the press is also, you could argue, a freedom to mislead people. They would say it's just their point of view. I think actively they're misleading people on this. But for Boris Johnson to misrepresent what happened here, to not mention that Mandela was covered up, to not mention that this has happened many times before, I really think speaks to the fact we have a person who's completely incapable of uniting the country. And that's quite rare. That really is quite rare. This is quite a new thing to have a prime minister actively looking to divide people internally through lies. Thatcher did it in, regards to the miners' strike, regards to Falklands. I haven't really seen a prime minister do it with such venom since, not Theresa May, certainly, not Tony Blair or Gordon Brown, not internally, not this clearly.
I'm not sure.
I think it was a clear. I think it was his misrepresentation was like a right-wing journalist. If a right-wing journalist had said what he'd said, it would have been indistinguishable. I thought. With
Theresa May, you had the citizens of nowhere, didn't you? And then with Cameron and Osborne, you had the strivers and the skivers. Divide and rule is obviously divide and rule is a strategy which Conservative prime ministers have used from
divisive rhetoric is one thing. He was misrepresent. Like, he's in receipt of all the facts as the prime minister. He knows that Mandela's statue's been covered up, right? He knows that all the statues in Parliament Square have been covered up, and he's just talking about Churchill because he's trying to feed into a completely misleading media cycle. I do think he did that in such a way, especially with the tweets that was relatively new. I do think, and it's overused. I think it was kind of a bit Trumpian. He was inserting himself into a very online culture war-y moment. A couple of years ago, this would have been just like a talk radio spiked thing. And now you have the prime minister talk about it. I think. It's difficult to say. If you go back 2-3 years, how would the PM respond? I don't think it'd be like this.
I suppose we do have an example, because in 2017, I suppose we did bring up that example. Churchill was boarded up for the Million Man March. We didn't hear about it. Potentially Boris Johnson is someone who will intervene in these kind of talk radio controversies that sort of exercise the right on Twitter, but are genuinely of no consequence whatsoever. This is just reasonable precautionary policing, right? If you go to Notting Hill Carnival, things are boarded up. It's not because, people want to attack fundamentally the culture of Notting Hill. It's just that when you get a lot of rowdy people in the same place, something might get broken. So better be safe than sorry. That's all that's going on here. I want to go to one more. We're not going to spend too long on statues today because we talked about statues quite a lot on Wednesday. But it's a very interesting topic. I mean, obviously, lots of history is crystallized in those, or representations of history anyway. But I wanted to go quickly to the issue of Robert Baden-Powell in Poole. So he was the founder of the Scouts, but also a fan of Nazi Germany. Apparently homophobic as well. But I mean, he was as a gay person, I don't find it surprising when someone in the first half of the 20th century was homophobic or whatever. But I saw, Aaron, you share this quite entertaining image of someone standing next to the Robert Baden-Powell statue in Poole. I just wanted to get you to talk about it before we move on to our next piece. So this is a woman standing there. British history matters.
Yeah. Completely right. Maybe it's time we started teaching it to our school children. Maybe it's time we started teaching British history and what Britain did in Ireland, Malaya, Kenya, British Guyana, India. Maybe we teach kids about that. And then the response might be, well, that's not British history. That's Kenyan history. Well, you can't just pick and choose. You can't just say, oh, I'm so proud of the British Empire. It did great things. And then you say, well, we should teach people about it. Actually, perhaps not. We should teach people history. But if you were to say to this lady, let's talk about the Mau Mau uprising. Let's talk about how Britain locked up in concentration camps approximately 1.5 million people in Kenya. Let's talk about how Britain worked alongside the Dutch to repress the Indonesian national liberation struggle in 1945. They also, by the way, very, very rarely touched upon, they worked alongside Japanese armed forces as well. Bear in mind, this is literally immediately after the Second World War, to stop a national liberation movement in Indonesia. I doubt she means that. I think she means, I don't know, teaching about the history of the Scouts. Presumably that's more important to this lady than policies of enforced famine in places like Ireland and Bengal.
Well, I mean, I suppose what it should be is protect the narrative we've told us about ourselves, right? Because the concern these people have is not with historical facts. I mean, precisely what the left and what Black Lives Matter want in this situation is for the truth about colonialism to be told. I mean, it's, the truth about British history does not make the establishment and the elites look good, which I suppose, I mean, you can say that the left, they just intrinsically want the truth to come out. But also, I mean, I think they think that if the truth about Britain's past 400 years were known, that would put a different light on the government. I mean, people just want the facts out there.
Yeah.
And I think this whole, people want to rewrite history. People want to challenge the fake narrative we've been told about what constitutes British history. It's the complete opposite of what that poster was suggesting.
And it's not about making people look. Nobody alive today is guilty for what happened in Ireland in the 17th century with Oliver Cromwell. Nobody's saying that. What we're saying is, if you want to fully understand racist policing, a racist criminal justice system, if you want to fully understand how race intersects with class and gender in regards to inequality in this country, or foreign policy decisions, or the political economy of the wealthy countries to poor ones, you need to know this stuff. That's all people say, right? It's not about making people feel guilty. It's if we want to have an honest conversation about the number of deaths of Black people in police custody. This is a really important bit of context. Britain behaved really badly in large parts of the world. And what's remarkable is, if you say to somebody, Ireland in the early 19th century was as densely populated as England, just as densely populated as England. People are like, really? I mean, it's barely populated now. Ireland in the early 19th century had a larger population than it does today. There's no other country in Europe, I think in the global north, that has this. People talk about various famines in various countries. That's an astonishing fact. It's the country next door to us. Why did that happen? Because they had the misfortune of being an English colony, effectively. Let's talk about that history.
We've got nearly 1,500 of you watching. Let's get to 2,000 while we're still live. So share the show link and tweet on the hashtag TiskiSour. That was statues. It wasn't actually statues that really got the culture warriors going over the past 24 hours. No, it was a 1970s sitcom, Fawlty Towers. So the drama started not so much with the actual story, but with this headline from The Guardian. So can we bring this up? So we've got Fawlty Towers, Don't Mention the War episode removed from UK TV. And the response to this was explosive. Again, let's start with Piers Morgan. Always a good person to start with. He says, stupid. Can we get this up? This is all getting utterly ridiculous. Ian Martin is more dramatic. Can we get this up? The woke madness is speeding up. Joked about this last night. Thank goodness have it on DVD. Presumably this will be illegal by the weekend. And then Martin Daubney, so he's former editor of Lads Mag before becoming a Brexit Party MEP. Absolutely inevitable. They were going to come for Fawlty Towers next. This is becoming the UK's year zero. All of the history of a nation or people before year zero is largely deemed irrelevant because it will ideally be purged and replaced from the ground up. This is all from a headline. No one's read the story. No one knows what this is actually about. We'll tell you what it's actually about in one moment. First of all, let's listen to Julia Hartley-Brewer's freak out this morning on Talk Radio.
Fawlty Towers Don't Mention the War episode is the very latest to come under attack, to be removed by the BBC because apparently it's so offensive. It's a whole episode based on laughing at racists. What is offensive about that? This is just identity politics on steroids. And identity politics doesn't do anything except divide us. It doesn't ensure a single child, whether black or white, gets a better education. It doesn't help a single person, whether black or white, get a better job, live in a nicer area, or save them from police brutality. It doesn't stop one incidence of racism. This is just silly, woke snowflakes. The trouble is, though, the silly woke snowflakes are no longer on Twitter or Instagram. They have now formed a mob, and it's mob rule on our streets. It is censorship. It is Orwellian. We are back in Mao's Cultural Revolution Year Zero territory, and it's downright dangerous. Britain cannot and should not wipe out our history and our culture because of the snowflakes.
So, I mean, obviously the most ridiculous thing about that is the snowflakes, who I suppose she's talking about the left-wing millennial Black Lives Matters protest on the street. Generation Z, younger. The argument she's making is that these people demanded for British classic comedy to be taken down because it doesn't meet their demands of what, you know, political correct comedy should look like. No one asked for Fawlty Towers to come down. People care about police violence and structural inequalities, not Fawlty Towers. But also, I mean, all of these people in this collective freakout have missed the actual context of the story. Which is much less dramatic than they've all made out. So the show wasn't taken down because of the don't mention the war scene, where Basil Fawlty is, you know, dealing in a kind of inappropriate way with a German family, but because a different character, repeatedly used the N-word over and over again, and sort of, it was the butt of a joke. So I don't know if that's the kind of history that Julia Hartley-Brewer is desperate for us to protect from the woke brigade, as she calls them. Now that scene has already been edited out by the BBC. So on iPlayer, where that exists, it's already been edited out. John Cleese, the creator of the show, he approved that. And Netflix and UK TV, they were airing an unedited version. So an edited version exists where they've taken out the N-word part. UK TV hadn't got round to it. It seems like they've just taken it down, so they have the time to edit out that 30-second clip, which John Cleese actually agrees should be edited out. And now suddenly, this is, again, a civilizational meltdown moment. It's ridiculous.
Did you see the tweet as well about somebody tweeted a picture of like Loaded or Nuts magazine, McCoy's crisps, and a Yorkie, and it's like not for girls.
Yeah, I saw that.
And he's like, "This is our culture." And you think, you know, the Italians have got Da Vinci and Dante Alighieri. You know, the Iranians have got Avicenna and Rumi. The Germans have got Goethe and Leibniz, and we've got McCoy's crisps. I mean, don't do Britain down like that, for God's sake. Oh, culture! You got a great deal of important cultural figures in this country. I mean, it speaks almost this sort of the vacuity of these people. Why would you care about the branding of crisps? Why would you get so? Where do you find the energy to get so outraged about the temporary pulling of an episode of Fawlty Towers? I like Fawlty Towers. I think it's really funny. I'm not. Like you're saying, the important point to make here is that nobody called for it to be pulled. Maybe some TV execs, got scared. Maybe they were just going to review a bunch of content. That would be right, because the N-word features in it, right? Okay, let's review a bunch of content, pull it, and let's just, precautionary principle. Good. What's the problem?
Just also edit the 10 seconds out, re-upload it. No one cares. No one cares.
Yeah, it's not that big a deal. It's the idea of like civilizational collapse. Who would have thought civilizational collapse would be so boring? I thought civilizational collapse would mean, see millions of people displaced, war, famine. That's normally what civilizational collapse looks like.
Yeah.
But apparently we got it wrong. Apparently it's when somebody withdraws an episode of a comedy from the 1970s.
And when Pot Noodle move on from their advertising campaign of calling it the slag of all snacks, I think that was that was what your fella getting angry about Yorkies was getting annoyed about. I want to go to a couple more stories where Black Lives Matter's protests are blamed for something they didn't ask for, or in this case, asking for something they didn't ask for. So there has been a bit of a pattern whereby someone makes a demand, a local newspaper or a national newspaper covers it, and then loads of people on the right angry share it. But it turns out, the origin of this demand is not all that it seemed. We're going to go through a couple. So the first one is about the White Cliffs of Dover. Let's go to a headline for Kent Online. So the subheading for this, or the slogan for this website, is News You Can Trust. The headline: Call to rename the White Cliffs of Dover after Black Lives Matter is criticised as moronic and detrimental to fight against racism. So the premise here: people have called the White Cliffs of Dover. The sort of petition they're looking at. The claim was that everything that's called white should now be called black. Blah 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 blah. This was their most popular story, right, at the time. Still is their most popular story today, actually, and it caused outrage on Twitter. So let's look at some of the people hate sharing this this article. Sorry, so we can hear the left-wing extremists now want to change the name of the White Cliffs of Dover. Nothing is safe from these hashtag snowflakes. Then we've got the world has gone completely mad. And finally, BLM want the White Cliffs of Dover renamed FFS. They can take their renaming, get on a boat at Dover, and F off. So everyone's getting very annoyed. You've got lots of UK Union Jack emojis. Now, this demand didn't come from, the Dover chapter of Black Lives Matter. There might well be one. I've got no idea. It came from a white woman named Hannah Stubbs, who started the petition to troll Black Lives Matter. It has 80 signatures. So this is a story which could concoct, a petition which was started to troll the Black Lives Matter movement by a white lady, probably on the right, which then gets written up by a local paper just so they can get clicks. And then everyone on, and then this is a big story for, it's wokeness gone mad. It's like, literally, this had nothing to do with Black Lives Matter from beginning to end. Exactly the same thing happened with Harold Wilson. So there's a statue of Harold Wilson in Huddersfield. Let's go to a headline from the Yorkshire Examiner, or Yorkshire Live, I think. Fury over claim that Harold Wilson statue should be pulled down. And this story even got a comment from a Labour MP. So the subheading, Barry Shearman says, any suggestion that former Prime Minister was racist are shameful. So here we've got a headline, a comment from the Labour MP, again, hate shared by many people. Now, let's take a look at who made this demand. This one's even more ridiculous. So it is, the demand was actually just a tweet, and the tweet was from an account called Reet Yorkie Pud. I think we can take a look at this account. He's got 225 followers, and the timeline is full of retweets of UKIP and Brexit Party politicians. And this got a comment from a Labour MP, a headline in Yorkshire Live, and shed loads of hate shares of people saying the Black Lives Matter movement's gone mad. It's a slippery slope. This is completely concocted from beginning to end.
It's also like we don't know the extent to which somebody screen grabbed something, sent it to a WhatsApp group, and it becomes guaranteed. If you were to poll people out there, has Harold Wilson been sort of mentioned as somebody who should come down? I mean, I would believe if it was like 35% of the public were like, yeah, that's being touted. I'm sure I heard that somewhere. It's kind of background noise, right? Really different, really, on the basis of one tweet. And this used to happen all the time with like Farage. People would say crazy things about UKIP, which just weren't true. If we leave the European Union, X will happen. It could be just as crazy as Brussels are responsible for X, right? It went both ways. But every time Farage heard something, I'd be like, this is just ridiculous. Listen to yourself. And I do feel like that should just be the response here. These are hysterical crybabies. Do they really believe it? That's what I want to know. Does Julia Hartley-Brewer really think that UK TV's withdrawn it for good because of the snowflakes? Does she really believe that? I don't think she does. This is about her. This is about her, staying in nice clothes and eating in nice restaurants and getting that, that new conservatory the year after next. That's her job. That's her industry, outraging people on social media.
I think that's probably true. We're going to go on to a story about what the protests are actually about if we don't get distracted by pot noodles and tweets by right-wing people with Union Jack emojis. So there are plenty of people on the right who want to distract people with a stupid culture war about Fawlty Towers or the White Cliffs of Dover that no one in the Black Lives Matter movement is actually asking for. So what do Black Lives Matter's protesters want? It's just to be treated fairly by the state, by employers, and especially by the police. On Wednesday, we covered some examples, some clips of black people being treated unfairly by the police. Another example emerged this week. So I want to go first to the tweet of the person who shared this video. So she says, yesterday, my parents were stopped and questioned in their own driveway for driving a motor vehicle on the road and because they can. It's suspicious to walk from your car to your house while black. The UK is not innocent. Now, let's take a look at the video she was sharing.
Whether it looks funny or not, you were driving with a motor vehicle on a road.
Yeah.
Parked up, so therefore I'm requiring you to provide proof of drivers.
You are kidding us right now.
Because
you can see why people get upset. You can see why you piss them off, can't you?
Then I can confirm that you are the driver of the vehicle and that you live here and we're gone.
Well, why? I don't see that's not. No. The worst thing is those vehicles aren't registered here. We're staying at my mum's house, so you're not going to get anything from seeing who we are.
Done is just turn something that could have been.
No, you've turned it in. No, you've done that.
Into something it
no,
shouldn't.
You've done that by stopping us.
You've just jumped on the bandwagon.
No. You've done that. You've jumped on a bandwagon.
I appreciate what you're saying, yeah?
And I appreciate what you're saying.
And it does, because there's no
But you are throwing little comments.
It doesn't make any. This is unnecessary, and I'm going to admit that it's unnecessary. That man has seen us leave to go and get our car and come back. You've seen us reverse within 10 minutes. Oh, did he tell you we burgled a shop? What have we done? That's wrong.
They look suspicious.
We look suspicious.
Particular attention to them.
Oh, we look suspicious. Oh, so what is it then? Why are you stopping us then? Because we look suspicious.
No.
So the couple who were stopped and who were filming that were Ingrid Antoine Onikoyi, who's 47, and her husband, Falil Onikoyi, who's 50. So they were told they were stopped for glancing at a police car when going into one of their mother's garages. They were told it made them look suspicious. And when they objected, the female police officer said, you probably heard it there, you have turned something irate that shouldn't be. You were just jumping on the bandwagon of the current climate. So basically saying, why are you playing the race card? I mean, the reason they are is because white couples don't get stopped in those situations. I can 100% guarantee my parents have never been stopped for walking to a car because they're white. The couple gave an interview to Sky today. This is Ingrid Antoine Onikoyi explaining the event.
Initially, it was all fine. It was, as I said, we thought they were coming up to us, or we thought they'd pulled in because they were going to ask us if we'd seen like a criminal running down the road. So we thought, this is going to be exciting. But then when we were crossing the road, we were coming into the door, we realised that they were going on and on. He was stressing him for his driving licence and asking for, proof of who we are. And I thought, hold on a minute, this is reminding me of something I've seen on television, and it's not going to be my husband. I felt hurt because I just thought, hold on a minute, I don't do anything wrong. What does suspicious looking mean? I picture a robber with a bag on his back tiptoeing down a road. So, why do we look suspicious? Because I did say to him, I said, suspicious? What's suspicious? How do we look suspicious? And, the worst thing is through all of it, we still didn't get an answer for hardly anything. Yeah. So we're still in limbo.
I mean, this is how the police alienate people, right? So, I mean, the explanation she's giving there, it doesn't sound like she's historically had, a terrible relationship with the police. It sounds like a fairly middle-class couple. She's sort of saying, if they came over, I was expecting them to ask me about a crime that happened elsewhere. And then I realized, actually, I was the suspect in this situation, even though all we'd done is walk to a car. And I mean, something I think that this brings light to is the fact that I don't think British cops really understand why racial profiling is wrong. So we showed on Wednesday a clip of a police officer who had stopped someone and said, the reason I'm stopping you, is because you're black. But also, I mean, there was a black person who committed a crime, so I'm going to stop the black people. you feel like surely they understand the problem with racial profiling, but it seems over and over again that they think it is an acceptable thing to do. There was also a really interesting, I wish I got a quote actually, there's an interesting article in the FT today where the Interior Minister in Germany, in response to Black Lives Matter movement, said it's ridiculous conspiracy theory to suggest that our police have latent racism, was the claim that was being made. And then in the paragraph underneath it, you have the chair of the German Police Federation saying, well, I mean, why wouldn't you? If people carrying blue umbrellas committed all the crimes, then we would stop the people with the blue umbrellas, an outright defense of racial profiling. So it just does seem like we assume the police kind of like, we assume racial profiling, open racial profiling is a thing of the past, and it doesn't seem to be.
I mean, the attitude is, in the present environment, yeah, you're being recorded, and they're not even, remotely inhibited in this kind of, I think, quite brazen. I think it's quite overt racism. I mean, it is. One thing that was gutting for me was the lady didn't let them talk more. Just let them talk, let them give their reasoning as to why they're doing it, and we would have kind of sussed out why. I mean, it's just crazy. It is absolutely crazy that this is carrying on. But we've said this before; it's not new; it's just being recorded.
Okay, we'll be talking about a cancelling that the left did actually call for in one moment, that of Nigel Farage. That's a genuine win, even if very belated. But first, today the Office for National Statistics released figures showing April saw the UK economy shrink by 20%. That's the highest contraction on record. Our TV screens have been filled with graphs like this one. So it's showing how the depths of this recession are on a completely different scale to anything in recent history. Maybe we don't have that graph. Apologies. Given that comparison, so given the fact that this is such a more severe recession than we've seen before in terms, at least in the short term, it's not surprising that reporting has verged on the apocalyptic. But given this dip in economic activity was both necessary and planned, is it wrong for journalists and the news to be talking about this as an economic catastrophe? Is it not actually something that we expected and almost a good thing? I spoke earlier to Miatta Fahnbulleh, Chief Executive of the New Economics Foundation, to find out.
It definitely wasn't expected, and we knew we were stopping the economy, therefore the impact on GDP was going to be really profound. I think the thing that is alarming people is that I think it's an indication of what's to come. So for me, GDP figures are only one measure of progress or lack of progress. I think the thing that makes this number so worrying is that it's also coming hand in glove with rises in unemployment. It's coming hand in glove with the stories that we're hearing on the ground about genuine hardship that people are going through. It's coming hand in glove with the fact that we know the government is having to prop up and essentially pay the wages of about 9 million workers. So I think it's because it's an indicator of just how grave, and yes, it was expected. If you stop the economy, what do you expect? But we've never had to stop the economy like this, and we've never seen in such a short space of time the knock-on effects. And the knock-on effects matter because they matter for people's lives and livelihoods. And that is the story of this economic crisis. And that's going to be the really, really tough thing to get to grips with.
The big unknown, what everyone is debating, is whether or not we'll have a quick bounce back from this recession or whether we're going to see a much longer term effect of the coronavirus lockdown. What's your take on this question?
I can't see any world in which it's a quick bounce back. And, the Bank of England, when they did their projections, suggested that we would bounce back in a year. The OBR, and to be fair to them, they've got to use the assumptions as the government's working on, assumed we would bounce back after a couple of months after we eased lockdown. I think the truth is this is set to be a long and protracted recession for two reasons. Partly because it comes off the back of 10 years in which the economy was essentially ailing, 10 years in which we already had a squeeze in living standards. So living standards when we went into this crisis were no higher than they were before the financial crisis. So the fundamentals were weak, but there was also very little room to maneuver and very little cushion for people within the economy as it was. And then the second part of it is if you imagine that, even after the government eases as many of the restrictions that it can, we're still going to have some measure of social distancing. We're still going to have massive restrictions in what we can do. And for some sectors, hospitality, retail, it will be absolutely profound. But across the piece, it just means that people will be using and wanting things far less, which means demand will drop in the economy, and it will be very, very hard for certain sectors to bounce back straight away until a vaccine comes, if a vaccine comes, when it comes, and we have immunity. So this feels like we're in it for the long haul. And I think the big question becomes, what's the package of things that we put in place in order to mitigate the worst impacts of that on people, but to also start thinking about how we re-gear the economy and how we kind of build it back, but into something better than the thing that we left at the other side of this crisis.
And so in terms of overall economic activity, I feel like probably we've been through the worst in terms of, the steep drop. But in terms of the human effects, so unemployment, etc., is the worst yet to come?
I think so, because I think what we have at the moment is, so if you think about the debate, we are still in the, if you like, the throngs of the public health crisis. The economic crisis is sort of ticking along behind that. Some of the headline stats indicate that things are looking pretty bad and are feeling bad for people, but it's yet to filter through. So, we've seen an increase in unemployment of about 850,000 people in April. So we're now at 2.1 million, which is pretty staggering in such a short space of time. But the underlying indication suggests that that number is about to get higher. And some of those who are currently furloughed, as the government, and if the government chooses to withdraw the furlough scheme, I think will be at risk of unemployment. So my sense is that we have yet to enter the full storm of the economic crisis. And that's in part because we're in a sort of holding position when people are sort of trying to get their heads around, well, how long will these restrictions last? What will they look like down? And I also think that, that there is a narrative that's sort of being pushed that, once we end lockdown, it will all be okay and it will all bounce back. But you just have to think through what social distancing means and looks like in the medium term to know that actually it's going to be much harder to get back to where we need to straight away. And it certainly will be very hard unless you have very focused, determined and consistent government intervention to help us weather this.
So that was Miatta Fahnbulleh, Chief Executive of the New Economics Foundation. I think we can get up for you now that graphic that I was going to show you before the interview. So this is the Sky News graphic of the economic data. So you can see there that you've got all of the previous recessions in living memory, where you have a sort of steady dip that doesn't go down, too low, and then you've got this almost vertical black line, which is the 2020 recession. So a straight cut of a quarter of economic output for the month of May. So yeah, really, really phenomenal stuff. We also had data this week, which was, because I suppose the argument I was making there to Miatta was that should we worry about this, given that we needed a lockdown, it was medically necessary, and what we wanted to happen was for the economy to slow down? Should the government see this as a failure or a problem? And I think on the face of it, no. What does show them to have failed is actually the OECD statistics, which came out yesterday, and they showed that Britain is going to have the biggest recession, as well as having the highest death rate and the longest lockdown. And that's because we entered a lockdown super late. At the time, it seemed like because they wanted to keep the economy, moving, and it has ended up being the most self-defeating error of a British government in probably my lifetime. Aaron, what do you make of this economic data? How worried should we be? I'm a bit concerned this is going to become a sort of scaremongering thing. So they're going to start saying, what we're hearing so often now is people have, we've worried about the health effects of coronavirus, but we've sort of ignored the economic effects. And maybe now we have to start making some compromises. Let's only have a 1 meter rule where we have to, only be 1 meter apart instead of 2 meters apart. I feel like this, those kind of scary graphs could end up being used in a bit of a sinister way.
Yeah, I do think, and also the idea of a quick recovery, I think, is nonsensical. Clearly, next year, particularly, I'm sure we'll see incredible numbers because we're coming from such a terrible place. And we talked about it many times. Of course, it's a pandemic economy. It's not like a war economy. In a war economy, you have the full mobilization of factors of production. In a pandemic, you obviously do the complete opposite. So we knew this was coming. And you're right. We should only really judge failure in comparison to other countries. However, I do think people have been kind of shocked at the extent of it. And I saw one tweet today which said, we've just lost 18 years worth of economic growth, which is to say we're back in terms of GDP to where we were in 2002, which technically is correct. But also we have to remember that basically the economy hasn't grown for 10 years when you measure it per person, right? Which is the best way to measure GDP. If you've got a bigger labour market because more people are working, because of, population increase, immigration, etc., GDP per capita is what matters. It hasn't really increased it has very marginally for about 10, 11 years. Well, actually, it's gone down in dollar, but that's because we've had currency devaluations. But in terms of pounds, it's kind of just marginally, just ever so slightly gone up. So, we've lost 18 years of growth. Well, there wasn't much really for most of that period anyway. Where I think the coronavirus is going to play a major role is it's massively accelerating already quite big structural change in the economy, particularly around the high street, particularly around online shopping. And so, for instance, I've seen a couple of businesses locally where I live. They've been around 20, 30 years, and they just say, you know what, this was the final nail in the coffin. That's going to have happened for a number of we've seen it with chain restaurants, retail chains. So, they were already on their way out, but COVID's kind of the final nail. And the question is then, okay, well, what do we want our high streets to look like? What do we want our industries, the future, to be? What kind of jobs do we want people to have, right? If all of a sudden retail looks like Amazon Go, if we have self-driving cars, etc., 10, 15, 20 years time, if logistics becomes increasingly automated, where are people going to work? And that's a big question. And I think coronavirus has probably accelerated it. But I don't think we'll be looking at where we were in terms of our GDP in early 2020. I don't think we'll get back to that for a long, long time because of a downturn in global travel, services, just people going out drinking, shopping. It won't be the same for a long, long time. I think 3, 4, 5 years. If you own a bar, I don't think you're expecting custom to be what it was for a long, long time. And there are lots of people out there with very, very small margins. So even just a slight downturn in the longer term means major, major consequences.
I think I need to correct myself because I think I said that was data for May. In fact, that was data for April. We're yet to see the state of the economy last month. That will come out in a month's time, presumably. Anti-racists are not claiming Fawlty Towers as a scalp they care about. Our next story, though, is more genuinely significant. So Nigel Farage, ex-UKIP leader and now head of the Brexit Party, has been stoking racial hatred in this country for decades, from blaming HIV rates on immigration to standing in front of that infamous poster of refugees with the header breaking point. Farage is a man more responsible than anyone for the amplification and mainstreaming of far-right narratives in this country. Yet for the last 3 years, LBC have provided Farage with a primetime platform 5 days a week. That's it's a huge platform, a huge reason he has so much influence in this country still. However, that was only until this Thursday. So let's look at the outburst which sparked Farage's downfall. So this is a tweet from Nigel Farage. A new form of the Taliban was born in the UK today. Unless we get moral leadership quickly, our cities won't be worth living in. In case you missed the context, the Taliban, or who he's referring to as the Taliban, is the Black Lives Matter movement. On Tuesday, he was asked about this on Good Morning Britain. This was his defense.
Just to clarify, why did you compare Black Lives Matter protesters to the Taliban?
Do you know, the BBC have consistently over the last week refused to tell people the truth about Black Lives Matter. The slogan, Black Lives Matter, and the wanting to end injustice and inequality is a laudable aim. The organisation, Black Lives Matter, is a far-left Marxist organisation whose chief aim is to defund and close down police forces so that we would live under anarchy.
Oh, you're full of such utter nonsense, Nigel Farage. I understand that you're struggling to be relevant, but let me tell you something. The only thing you're an expert on, Nigel Farage, the only thing you're an expert on right now is your backside, because every word out of your mouth stinks.
That was quite entertaining. In any case, 2 days after that, LBC tweeted this. So Nigel Farage's contract with LBC is up very shortly, and following discussions with him, Nigel is stepping down from LBC with immediate effect. We thank Nigel for the enormous contribution he has made to LBC and wish him well. So this was all quite abrupt. The language used is quite careful. They haven't said they've fired him, but his contract wasn't over. So he left before his contract was up. He was in fact due to have a live show that day. So they had to pull him from the air that evening. Someone else, I think it was Ian Dale, took his place. So Aaron, I mean, this is a genuine cause for celebration, even if it is, well, incredibly belated.
Yeah, I mean, the whole thing's just puzzling. I mean, who thinks they can get away with saying that? It's kind of incredible, calling a bunch of people looking for equality under the law, you know, comparing them to the Taliban, and the whole thing of, oh, our cities won't be worth living in soon. He lives in like rural Kent, right? Nigel Farage hasn't believed that British cities are worth living in probably since like 1962. He's complained before about people, you know, if you were driving out or getting the tube from central London, going through zones 1, 2, 3, 4, then going out through some of the suburbs, you would struggle to hear English. He's gone on record saying that he doesn't like modern city life. So the idea that would change because of Winston Churchill's statue being boarded up for the 5th time in 10 years or whatever, just kind of seems absurd. What Farage does, you know, the more history you read on this stuff, the more you realize he's just relitigating the exact same things that were made in the 1980s. You know, in the 1980s, a gay Labour parliamentary candidate was a room went round that he had attended the Gay Olympics. Nobody actually knew what this was, but it was a Sun front page.
Yeah, I didn't know that.
Yeah, Peter Tatchell. That was what they got him with.
Tatchell, right?
Yeah, it was the by-election in Bermondsey and Southwark, and yeah, he'd gone to the Gay Olympics, and then sort of, you know, Michael Foot was being asked, do you have a gay candidate? Of course, the Labour left was saying, yeah, we've got, you know, we stand by LGBT people. Not even Neil Kinnock would be like, yeah, sick, you know, or Michael Foot. None of the kind of at that time the soft Tribunite left. And people like Farage are just saying the same things that they said then. You know, cities are unlivable. Cities are now subject to cultural Marxism and minorities and the radical left. That was the exact same argument that was made against the GLC under Ken Livingstone in the early to mid 1980s. These people are stuck in a time warp. What I think Farage has seen is probably a political opportunity to ensure he's relevant after Brexit with Black Lives Matter and kind of increasingly English, it's important to say English, identitarian issues like Churchill.
I want to look at some of the background to this. There was an interesting article in the HuffPo. They'd spoken to some of the staff at the LBC, because obviously disquiet has been going on there for a very long time. What he said this week wasn't really, you know, qualitatively worse than what he's been saying for the past 2 decades. But let's get up a couple of quotes from this article speaking to staff there. So they write, a black staffer at Global who asked to remain anonymous had previously told HuffPost UK that many Global staff members want Farage out. The staffer said, the man is vile and racist. I'm upset he's working on a station across the corridor from the UK's biggest black music station and he's allowed to say those comments on air. So later in that article, Nadine White, she's the author of the article, quotes a source saying, pretty much every black person here is upset that Farage continues to have a platform, yet Global says it's committed to equality. This says a lot. Now, the context here, these aren't necessarily people who work for LBC, because Global is a very big organization. You might not have heard of it, but it's in the background running many radio stations you probably have heard of. They include Capital and Capital Extra. Capital Extra is a particularly interesting example here because unlike LBC, they have lots of ethnic minority hosts and they play predominantly black music. And there was some other background in this article that I thought was, you know, very interesting about the culture and the function of Global. So this conglomerate, this company that runs radio stations. So let's get this section of the article up. So it says, established in 1990 and acquired by Global in 2005, Choice FM was the UK's first legal black radio platform. It was rebranded without warning to Capital Extra, billed as an urban dance platform in 2013 during Black History Month. All specialist shows such as gospel and soccer were scrapped, never to be reinstated. Sorry, the introduction I should have given you is that Global bought Choice FM. So Choice FM, very successful black music station. Global bought it and then they shifted it without telling anyone or without getting any consent to Capital Extra. Let's go to the next graphic. The revered station's legacy has faded, with many deeming this move from Global as a direct affront to the black community and an attempt at erasing an important part of black culture from the mainstream. So this is a company that bought Britain's first legal black radio station, and who, against the wishes of the black staff, changed its sort of role, its name, its function, and then kept employing Nigel Farage down the corridor. So you can see sort of the toxic role they've played in terms of Britain's cultural industries. And let's go at the people who were making these decisions. Let's take a look at the people who bought Britain's first legal black radio station. So this is the executives of Global. So you've got 10 people, all of them white, 9 of them men. One thing I find quite entertaining is the only woman there. Her job is chief people officer. What is it? What job is chief people officer? It's like, oh, women, they're people. The idea that these are the people who are making all of these decisions, I suppose, explains quite a lot as to what LBC's output is like. They also have Nick Ferrari on in the morning, who, as we saw on Wednesday, has said some pretty racist things on air. Aaron, what do you make of all of this? I listen to LBC because I quite like talk radio, but it is, the fact that they feel they can get away with having, nearly all of their hosts are white guys. The furthest left they go is sort of James O'Brien, a sort of Remainer liberal, and everyone else is, whenever they're pushing the boat out, it is definitely to the right. They're shifting the Overton window in that direction.
Yeah, they're all anti-left. James O'Brien, you'd probably say he's a liberal, They're anti. Majid Nawaz calls himself a liberal. I don't think he is a liberal in any meaningful sense of the word, because he can't, tolerate disagreement and debate. They're anti-left. Majid Nawaz is vehemently anti-left. James O'Brien hates the left. He was calling all Labour Party. He tweeted Labour Party members are all Holocaust deniers. I was like, this is an insane thing to say. He said a party full of Holocaust deniers. It's just repulsive, really revolting thing to say. So you're right. And what's interesting is you brought up a picture of the kind of executive team. Presumably the head of people is HR or something. But if you got up the sort of the LBC radio roster, they all look related, Nick Ferrari, Ian Dale, Clive Ball, James O'Brien. There was a couple of people. Tom Swarbrick used to work for Theresa May. They kind of, if you would like, it's a kind of family. They're kind of brothers and uncles and nephews. I can totally believe that. It's not even that they're all white. They all have the kind of same skin complexion. They all look the kind of same. It's odd. And look, at the end of the day, we have to say Britain's it's a white country primarily, but London is a really mixed city. In no way reflects London politically, ethnically, culturally, like not at all. You couldn't have a poorer reflection of what London looks like and sounds like and thinks. And something should be done about that. Farage went. The question is now who's going to replace him? And it can't just be, let's get a black or brown person with the exact same ideas. Let's get, there's very few of those around in their defense, but, a black conservative or a brown conservative. Come on, let's have a bit of dissensus. But the problem is they won't ever do that. Owen Jones has had his own show on there a few times, Pilots. They would never make it a radio show because, of course, he'll be right about so many things. He'll prove so many of their regulars to look so stupid so quickly. All of a sudden, I think that'll become a problem for the brand. Their brand is kind of very angry, 50-something white males. And actually, I don't think necessarily that's the audience. I think if there was a purely business decision going on, they'd get a young BAME woman. We'll see.
Well, with someone, I think with left-wingers, they're worried that they'll critique the basis of the company, because, it is a bit of it's an asset-stripping company, buys smaller radio stations, lays off staff, shuts them down. It seems like it has a bit of a parasitical relationship to the UK's cultural industries,
and its tax arrangements aren't entirely
exactly. So 100%. They don't want to get a host who is calling out that kind of thing. I just wanted to point out that in terms of insular groups of people from the establishment running Britain's news organisations, there was some breaking news today, which was George Osborne. He became editor at the Evening Standard, of course. He's stood down. Today we found out his replacement, and it's former British Vogue deputy editor Emily Sheffield, who, wait for it, you might not have heard of her, I hadn't either, but she just so happens to be ex-Prime Minister David Cameron's sister-in-law, right? So, I mean, it was a joke when George Osborne got that job. He went straight from being the Tory Chancellor to being the editor of London's most widely read newspaper without any journalism background. Now he's been replaced, and he's been replaced by David Cameron's sister-in-law. You know, these people will have sat at not even professional dinner parties together, like, you know, just like someone's birthday. You know, these people all know each other, all come from exactly the same background, and now they're running London's, you know, probably most politically significant newspaper. The Metro might be more widely read, but the Evening Standard definitely has more political influence. I mean, you couldn't make it up, could you?
You think? I mean, it's finished, right? Do you not think it's finished, Michael? Well, I mean,
we don't know. We don't know what's going to bounce back after that.
She said that, you know, she's there to lead on making it a digital first company.
Making it a digital thing, yeah.
Yeah, the whole point of the Evening Standard is that's their thing. It's a free sheet which gets loads of eyeballs and it sells advertising. You know, 2/3 of the Evening Standard is basically advertising. That's not going to work with an online model. I mean, they're finished. The whole revenue model of the free sheet doesn't seem to work anymore. So I don't know. I mean, you're saying it's influential. I think it's probably, in a way, it's probably a symbol of the company's sort of imminent collapse. And actually, if you look at the Lebedev's other assets, the Eye has really struggled. Obviously, the Independent's it's no longer a newspaper, despite the absolute shambles of it regularly showing a front page on the front pages of tomorrow's newspapers. It's like showing Novara Media's front page. We don't have a front page. Just living in complete denial of the fact they're no longer a newspaper. I think the Evening Standard will probably follow suit. You know, will it be an influential thing? No, like people on LBC and Talk Radio and BBC will talk about it, but I think average Londoner, I think the Evening Standard's influence has been going down for a very long time. I remember in 2004-08 during the London mayor elections, when they went for Ken Livingstone, especially in 2008, it was a really big player, and sort of Boris Johnson could not have won without the Evening Standard. I just don't think that's the case now. I just think it's kind of like it's pathetic. So yeah, mate.
They really went for Sadiq Khan, actually, didn't they? There was a really toxic, hostile campaign against him, often, you know, seemingly a bit racially motivated.
Yeah.
And then I remember, you know, the day then he gets a stomping victory the next day, like, oh, Sadiq Khan, maybe he's okay, great. So they sort of had to go back with their tail between their legs. Obviously, Sadiq Khan isn't the kind of guy who sort of likes to have a populist showdown with national newspapers. So I think he was fine for them to come back with their tail between their legs, make peace.
The thing is, you know, Michael Foot actually was the editor of the Evening Standard, I think, just immediately following the Second World War. You know, it wasn't always a really right-wing newspaper. Yeah, it wasn't always a really right-wing newspaper. So, you know, in a way, there's a bit of a legacy there that's going to be lost. But influential, I don't know. I mean, I think the future of political influences is LBC, Talk Radio. I don't think it's print media. And I think these people realize that, right? I think there's a reason why Rupert Murdoch's gone into Times Radio. There's a reason why they bought Talk Radio. You know, okay, there's a bit of business going on. It might make some money, but primarily it's about creating a vehicle to advance certain political interests. And I think now people look at the sort of the hybrid of the radio / social media kind of platform as doing that far more effectively than the newspaper.
We're going to go to a Westminster story. We haven't really done any today, and it is that Ipsos Mori have released their approval ratings for political leaders. And Keir Starmer has come out very well. So they are sort of leading with the headline that the satisfaction with Keir Starmer is the highest of any opposition leader on record. And they've been doing these back to the beginning of the 1980s, I think. So we can get up, let's get up these satisfaction with leader of the opposition scores. Can we get that? Yeah, so how satisfied or dissatisfied are you with the way X person is doing their job as leader of the party? Now, Starmer is on plus 31, so that means 31% more people, or actually, yeah, 31% more people, or the number of people who approve of what he's doing is 31% higher than the number of people who disapprove. So that is equal to Blair at his peak in December 1994. Obviously, he went on to win a big fat majority. Cameron's peak was plus 23. Kinnock was plus 20, so not bad. And then he went on to lose. Miliband plus 19. He went on to lose. Smith obviously passed away. But I mean, this is looking pretty good for him. Let's get up this next graphic because I think it, it shows how this figure has come to. So can we get this up? So Keir Starmer satisfied 51, dissatisfied 20. So that's how he gets that plus 31 score. Jeremy Corbyn was never in the positive territory during his time as leader of the Labour Party. Obviously, there's a million explanations as to why that is that aren't his fault. But he peaked at 44% of people satisfied and 45% of people dissatisfied. David Cameron, again, he at one point had more people saying they were satisfied with him than Keir Starmer, but there were also more people dissatisfied. He is going to be very, very pleased with these results. Let's look at one more bit of bunch of information actually before I go to Aaron. So opposition ratings. Can we get this tweet up? So 2 months in, and you can see that compared to other leaders at this particular phase in the parliamentary cycle, he's far and away smashing it. On +31, Blair was only on +14 at this point in time. Miliband only on +9. Aaron, what do you make of these? I know that sometimes, you're not blown away by polls. I think voter intention polls at this point in an electoral cycle don't mean that much, but I think making a good first impression for an opposition leader does, history shows to be quite important.
Yeah, but what do you make of the fact that, the best poll for Labour right now shows Labour around 5 behind the Tories? I mean, if you've got Labour 5 behind the Tories, but you've got somebody with, almost historically unprecedented favourability, it would indicate that many of the people who like Keir Starmer aren't planning to vote Labour. That just from that data, that's what it would appear to indicate to me.
Well, the other way you can look at it is that, we can go on as well to
right now. If there's, if they're just off that data, I'm not saying
but right now, there's not going to be an election right now. So I suppose your strategic aim as a new leader of a party is to give a first impression of yourself, and then afterwards you can. Because from his perspective,
it's clearly good.
He's going to say the reputation of the Labour Party was trashed, and so he's going to have to get his popularity up and then let the Labour Party catch up.
Sure, but there is a discrepancy there. That's my point. And we've not really ever seen that before. So I do wonder. We've said this before. I don't really know what positive approval ratings mean. Right now, who would you prefer? The exact same data today had Boris Johnson. Who would you prefer as Prime Minister? Even though Boris Johnson approval ratings are far worse than Keir Starmer's, they would prefer to see Boris Johnson as Prime Minister than Keir Starmer. It's not as a measurable thing of approval. It's like, are they doing a good job as the member of the, as the leader of the opposition? Well, yeah, compared to Corbyn, oh my God, yeah, of course. Who would you
prefer? Do you like them, right?
Yeah, do you get a positive feeling about them? Exactly. But then that's quite context.
You get a positive feeling about them.
What's the is it context specific? Who was the predecessor? What did you think of the policies beforehand? Have they had a good month? So look, they're great. Team Starmer would be justified in thinking it's really important. But I do think there's quite a clear discrepancy in these amazing poll ratings. People still, despite all of this, people still favour Boris Johnson as Prime Minister, which I do find amazing. The Tories being ahead, I'm not surprised by, but I would have thought, Rishi Sunak would be. The fact it's not in the popular psyche to be like, Sunak should be the Prime Minister, not Boris Johnson, does surprise me. 60,000 people have died and he's basically gone missing for several months. I do find that particularly surprising. There's a discrepancy there, and I do think that it's going to go if the strategy is, I
don't think the public think enough about politics to have an idea that, should we replace Boris Johnson with Rishi Sunak? That's a kind of Westminster idea. I think the public think you've got two options for Prime Minister, the Tory one, the Labour one. Boris Johnson is the Tory one. They want the Tories to be in power, even though they don't particularly like Boris Johnson.
We're going off the data that was included in this today, which is that they would prefer Boris Johnson as Prime Minister.
Yeah, let's get that data up. But I think that's probably because of association with the Tory party. Can we get that up? We can get that graphic up. Boris Johnson, 43% of people say they'd prefer him as Prime Minister. 38% say Keir Starmer. Again, it's sort of better than comparisons in recent history.
Well, it's the same as Jeremy Corbyn in July. Starmer's the same as Jeremy Corbyn in July 2017. He is. He's both on 38%.
Yep, you're correct. Although I suppose the Tory competitor is Theresa May was on 46%.
We're basically back where we were I think we're back where we were in July 2017, basically. But if you're looking at the respective politicians, that's what it. Again, I'm just going on what the data says. I think Keir Starmer is a much, for the public at large as an individual, much more appealing as a leader of the opposition. I'm not going to deny that. But there's some really weird stuff going on with that data. And the point is, if people who aren't remotely planning to vote Labour say, I really like this guy, that ultimately doesn't mean anything in politics. We might see something like that dynamic. There's many. We've had it many times with the Liberal Democrats where, a leader might be appealing to Tories. Nick Clegg, for Tory voters, I quite like him. The Lib Dems, I'd never vote for them. after 2010 and the Lib Dems. That was the Lib Dem strategy after 2010 to get those kind of Tory voters, those moderate Tories. They never got them. They completely collapsed the political force. So we'll see. It's an interesting one. It could happen. Don't rule it out. But
we need to see precisely where the people are who have the positive attitude towards Keir Starmer. Are they in sort of true blue areas, or are they in swing areas? They're probably more likely to be in swing areas than the people who really like Jeremy Corbyn, but we'll see. It depends. I suppose there were some seats that came into play because of the coalition that Jeremy Corbyn built. Anything else on this, or should we go to our final story, Aaron?
Go to our final story. I think we
disagree.
We disagree on this one, I think.
Well, it's so speculative, isn't it, at this point in time?
It is speculative.
Okay, we're going to go to our final story of the week. This Sunday, it's an important one. This Sunday will be the 3rd anniversary of the Grenfell tragedy, which took 72 lives back in 2017. What's shocking, people still haven't got justice for this remotely. But more than that, on a practical level, what's, I think completely outrageous, almost bewilderingly so, is how many buildings are still covered in the same type of flammable cladding that caused the Grenfell catastrophe. So I was assuming that when we saw that happen, when we found out what the context was, how that tragedy had happened, there would be a sort of whole government national effort, sort of kind of coronavirus style thing where you sort of throw all of the resources at the state at this national emergency, which is to get down this incredibly dangerous flammable cladding. 3 years later, it's still up. Okay, let's go to a quote again from the HuffPo, telling us the statistics. So official figures published on Thursday show that 300 high-rise residential and publicly owned buildings still have the same aluminium composite material, ACM, cladding that was wrapped around the West London block. Last year, the government said that all flammable ACM cladding would be removed by June 2020. But that figure only scratches the surface. It is estimated around 1,700 more buildings have some other form of dangerous cladding, such as timber or high-pressure laminate. So 3 years later, 3 whole years, people are still living in tower blocks, many of them still at the top of tower blocks, knowing that their home is coated in exactly the same flammable material that cost 72 lives. It's unbelievable that we are putting people through that. And then how did it happen? So there was a standoff. So obviously the government sort of instructed companies to take down this illegal cladding, but then you had a huge standoff between the state, building owners, and developers. So they were all saying, well, we don't want to pay for this. Everyone, but it was because the big problem here was that the regulations were so lax that developers kind of thought they were sort of playing by the rules. The government was sort of like, well, our regulations were loose. It was kind of your responsibility to put up safe stuff. So this whole sort of neoliberal model was basically the buck doesn't stop anywhere, which means that everyone tried to deny they had responsibility for it. And for years, 2 years in this case, you just had this stuff staying up. No one wanted to pay to take it down. In 2019, sort of realizing this stalemate, the government committed £600 million to pay for the removal of the Grenfell type cladding. So that's the aluminium composite material. And then in 2020, in the 2020 budget, they offered another £1 billion to remove all types of flammable cladding. But that happened, this still hasn't fed through, obviously, into this coming down from the buildings. And also, why did that take until 2019 and 2020? It should have, for the state to cough up £1.6 billion, that's nothing. That should have happened the day after the Grenfell tragedy. You should have had Theresa May stand up there and say, this is an absolute tragedy, what has happened, but we will do whatever it takes to make sure that we correct for this historic injustice, this complete error in how we've been doing regulations, to make sure that no one will have to live in fear of going through the same thing that families in Grenfell went through. And what did they do? They twiddled their thumbs for years. And 3 years later, you still got hundreds and hundreds of people living in huge death traps. It's unreal.
Neoliberalism has just eroded the capacity of the British state to really just do anything, to actually decisively do something. We've seen that with coronavirus. We've seen it in a whole panoply of ways. The trains in this country are terrible. Do something about it. We can't really. Do you think that's the same with this? I mean, because it does seem like quite a big project. The idea of a state actor, a state agency coming in, overseeing a sort of rapid shift here. I just think it's just so at odds with how governing elites have operated for the last 30, 40 years. I think it's a bigger problem than just one government. I'd like to know your thoughts, though. Yeah, no, I think it is. Well, I mean, I think it's a perfect storm, isn't it? Because you've got
as we've talked about so often in this coronavirus crisis, you've got a state which, even if it wanted to, just doesn't know how to, respond to crises. So I think with coronavirus, the state was very lax towards it. But I can't really see any rational, self-interested reason why they wouldn't have dealt with coronavirus better, because loads of their voters are dying. It doesn't, we can compare the results quite clearly between countries. 60,000 people dying compared to 30,000 or 20,000 people dying in Germany. It doesn't look good, for whichever party is in power. And it just seems
zero
like
in Vietnam.
Yeah, it seems like they were just incapable of having a more strategic response because neoliberalism has sort of eroded the capacity of the state. I think with Grenfell, you can also add that the people who died were not going to vote Tory anyway. So they were people from ethnic minority and working class backgrounds. Many people who live in these buildings, again, might be in social housing or, not wealthy enough to move out, like many conservative student accommodation. Exactly. So they might be thinking, one, if we, it's our friends in the developer industries, building owners, landlords, if they make those pay the cost, then that will, be costly to them. And the tenants, the people who are, scared for their lives, aren't going to be conservative voters anyway. So I think you've got a perfect storm of there not really being the political will and a lack of state capacity, which has just meant that there's, a complete stasis for years. Yeah,
I also think, because Britain, I think, is increasingly a managed democracy. I just think if it happened again, so what would happen? If there was another Grenfell, realistically, what would happen? The Tories slip by a couple of points. Generally speaking, the print media and BBC have their back. Okay, you might have to get a new prime minister. So what? I mean, the last three prime ministers have been Tories, and they've sort of, just one's replaced the other. Cameron replaced by May replaced by Johnson, and I genuinely believe Johnson will be replaced by, if this ends up terribly, he'll just be replaced by another Tory. And I think they'd likely win the next general election. Not planning on that, but I'm just saying that's how things look right now. So I think they'd probably look at, so what? It's a really weird moment. Democracies aren't meant to kind of not care less about 70, 80 people dying in a fire. It happened once, they didn't really care. It would happen again, I don't think they'd really care. They'd be like, so what? I mean, we've just had 60,000 people die, and it's not really hitting the Tories particularly hard. What's hitting the Tories hard is the Dominic Cummings story, because it's about a human error, hypocrisy. It's readily comprehensible. There's a human story there. But with Grenfell, with all these structural things, less readily identifiable on a personal level, and that's a problem. I think they wouldn't really care. They don't mind if it happens again. What's the political hit? 2 points in the opinion polls, no problem. Maybe I'm being overly cynical, but
it's a depressing end to the show. No, I think that's. I mean, in an even more sort of, depressing thought. My big fear with coronavirus is that now 60,000 people have died. People are going to get a bit immune to 72. What's 72? 60,000 people just died of coronavirus. We need to make sure that people retain the humanity of believing that life really matters, even if the Conservative government want to sort of say, oh, these people would have died anyway, whatever. It's just some dead people. Anyway, that's a very depressing end to the week.
We could take a question if you want, Michael. To not leave on such. I feel bad, because it's the weekend as well.
Yeah, well, if Fox can put in a question for that, he's going to be annoyed at you for that, Aaron. But
I know I'm sure it was a bad way to end. People, I kind of said somebody's saying they're loving the ever more prominent antagonisms between you and I, Michael. That's not true. We've always had productive disagreements.
It's true. We in the studio as well. People always ask me if we've fallen out. We never have. I've never fallen out with you, Aaron. I don't think Fox is going to give us a question. Unless you can see one in the comments, Aaron.
Let's part ways and say, look, the Tories are probably going to get away with 60,000 deaths and with no sort of real political overhead. Boris Johnson's increasingly disliked, but he's still preferred as the country's prime minister. These are challenging times for the left. And that's why you need to support new media. Go to novaramedia.com/support. That's my final message.
That was a very good segue. All right. Thank you, Aaron, for your company this Friday night. And thank you for watching Novara Media and Tisky Sour. We'll be back on Monday. So make sure you hit that subscribe button. Have a great weekend. This has been Tisky Sour on Novara Media. Good night.